and welcome to our live broadcast, Constitutionalism in an Authoritarian Populist Era, a comparative view of Israel and Turkey. Our aim today is to look at both countries, Israel and Turkey, and to shed some light on crucial and interesting developments in their history that have affected the state of their democracies and of their constitutional regimes. Though formally both are considered democracies in the Middle East, the most common descriptions of both point to a deterioration and weakening of their democratic mechanism and movement towards authoritarian populist regimes. In today's conversation, we will try to find out what lies behind these processes and to what degree it is possible to stop the deterioration that has already begun. It is important to note that despite the focus and the comparative perspective on Turkey and Israel and how the constitutional regime in both countries function in an authoritarian populist era, we are not assuming that these countries are similar in all respects. We are assuming however, that a comparative and an interdisciplinary perspective on Israel and other Middle Eastern countries is important for contextualizing Israel in this region and thus helps us explore the political, cultural, and social ties that link Israel and its population to the Middle East. What is Israel's place and role in the Middle East? Is Israel a foreign element in the Middle East or an inseparable part of it? These are questions that we see as important to the Israeli discourse and are part of what we do here at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and specifically within our research cluster called Israel in the Middle East. The Forum for Contemporary Turkish Studies, which has become part of that cluster, and which aims to further Israeli study of modern Turkey, was also a major motivation for the creation of today's event. My name is Dr. Tsameret Levy-Daphny, and here with me today is Professor Gila Stopler, Dean of the Law School and the Associate Professor at the College of Law and Business. She is Editor-in-Chief of the journal Law and Ethics of Human Rights. She has recently published an article entitled Semi-Liberal Constitutionalism in the journal Global Constitutionalism, and is co-editor of a volume on democratic backsliding and human rights, which will be published shortly in the journal Law and Ethics of Human Rights. Also, Dr. Felix Petersen is a research fellow in the Kovner Center for German History at the Hebrew University. He is a democratization scholar working now on postdoctoral research at the Kovner Center for German History at the Hebrew University and teaches constitutional politics at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Petersen, together with Zeynep Yanashmayan, is a co-editor of the volume titled The Failure of Popular Constitution Making in Turkey, Regressing Towards Constitutional Autocracy. I want to start first with Dr. Petersen. I want to ask you, we know that in the second half of the 20th century, the formation of constitutional regimes was seen as the best way to move from autocratic states to national democratic ones and to ensure the stable and secure existence of these countries. What was the promise of constitutional regimes, specifically in Turkey? What kind of problems was constitutional regime supposed to solve, and what kind of reality was it supposed to change?
Yeah, Tsameret, thank you very much for organizing the event. So I'll try to sort of disentangle your question a bit and answer them bit by bit. So first of all, like from a comparative political perspective, not necessarily legal perspective, constitutionalism in the 18th and 19th century is mainly the promise to create a non-arbitrary rational state, a limited government, which means that all acts of government should be grounded in law. Citizens should enjoy certain rights and freedoms vis-a-vis other citizens, but also vis-a-vis the state. And then it's also just simply a way to sort of more systematically and more effectively organize the state, right? So there's different forms of constitutionalism. Usually we associate constitutionalism with democracy, but as Gila will also allude a bit more later with regard to Israel, there's constitutional autocracies, dictatorships have constitutions, monarchies have had constitutions. So constitutionalism becomes sort of like a basic condition for just government with the 19th century. Now in Turkey, it promised, or the promise of constitutionalism would be exactly these general things, right? Limited government, rule of law, a separation of state powers. But then in the Turkish case, you also have very specific sort of promises, which each constitution that Turkey has had adopted over the past 130, 140 years carried like specific promises, right? So Turkey transitions to constitutionalism similar to Germany in the 1870s with the enactment of the 1876 Ottoman Constitution. But constitutionalism becomes only important for a state organization in Turkey, like in the early 20th century, in the interwar period. And sort of like, I would bracket it into three different periods. We have the first period, like the revolutionary period or the independence movement period, where Turkey drafts constitutions, two of them, one in 1921 and one in 1924, which were meant to sort of institutionalize the promise of a new nation state, a Turkish state, built on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. It promised republicanism, it promised secularism, modernization, liberalism, all these Western values. And so they had to draft a new constitution 3 years after adopting the first, because in the first years of government, they understood that the constitution would have to be more specific in order to be able to really organize this new state completely. Now, then we have in the 60s and 80s, in 61 and 82, we have two more constitutions, which are both drafted under supervision of the military. And they have both different sort of promises, right? So viewed from the perspective of the elite, and in particular the military, they were meant to ensure that the right people would be in power, even if you don't win elections. So they included a constitutional court, for example, which would allow the government to prohibit parties that violate certain constitutive principles of the state, such as nationalism or secularism. And it helped the government to close down over 25 parties between the 60s and the 90s. The second constitution was necessary, and the second military coup d'etat in the 80s was necessary, because the 61 constitution in the end was too liberal. And so in the 82 constitution, the military promised itself that it would include certain rail guards to ensure its dominance through institutions such as the National Security Council, which would like determine national politics. And that was spearheaded by the military, or by including rights on one hand, but also very broad grounds on which rights, individual rights, could be limited. So it's difficult to sort of like pinpoint one promise, but you see that constitutional politics in Turkey has always been like a political game where certain agents aim to realize very specific, subjective, individual aims of how the Turkish state should be organized and institutionalized. And that seems to be like the red line that sort of relates to different constitutions and different constitution-making attempts.
So we see that Turkey had a relatively long history of constitutionalism, but nevertheless, in your book, you mentioned that it is generally accepted that Turkey has been dysfunctional constitutional regime in which constitution making has never been democratic, popular, or inclusive. no room has been provided for minorities to be taken into account, and they all had weak political legitimacy. So how can we explain that? Why did all of these attempts fail to achieve its purposes and to solve the problems and actually to ensure democracy, I would say?
So first of all, I think that constitutions are continuously redrafted in Turkey because constitutionalism is important for the country, right? So one scholar, and I try to explain that as simple as possible, one scholar, for example, argues that Turkish constitutionalism is authoritarian because it is constitutionalist, but the content of constitutions gives the state a superior position and not the individual. So that would be a difference between democratic and authoritarian constitutionalism. Now, Turkey had to redraft its constitutions along the way for different reasons, right? So, and I think the most important reasons, if we go into the younger constitutional history, if we see the two military constitutions, they had to be redrafted because the regime didn't function in the way that was acceptable for the military. So the military tried to sort of fine-tune the system so that it was able to more actively influence how politics would be organized in the country based on the constitution. Now, that's interesting because if you think about authoritarianism or military dictatorship, you would usually think, why do they need a constitution?
Exactly.
Right? In Turkey, you have a sort of legalist, constitutionalist tradition, and that's part of the sort of Turkish interpretation of modern political organization, which is very formalist and legalist, but which sometimes lacks the necessary democratic substance that a constitution would have to have in order to guarantee that people can enjoy rights and freedoms. So the latest constitution-making attempt in 2011 and 13, which is basically the constitution-making process that we focus on in the book that you mentioned earlier, was necessary, and all political actors and social forces agreed that it was necessary first to really create a democratic, legitimate constitutional regime in the country, so to be legitimate towards Turkish citizens, but then also to create sort of a democratic system which would be legitimate in the eyes of European countries, because Turkey is still flirting with the idea or hoping to become a EU member state at one point. And so these were like sort of the two reasons why they would have to redraft another constitution again in 2011-14.
Okay, Felix, let's talk about the concept of failure. You claim in your book, and you also use the concept of failure in the title of your latest work, that a failure can contribute to our understanding of political developments. How? In what way?
I mean, so as you said in the beginning, so I'm a democratization scholar. So I come from a background where the literature that we would study mainly focuses on transitions in the 80s and 90s, right? So post-Soviet transitions in Latin America, transitions in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So generally transitions from non-democratic regimes to democratic regimes. And most of the scholarship would always sort of like sketch ideal scenarios, what you would have to do in order to become a democracy. Now, when you're not a democracy, it's not always helpful to sort of understand what you have to do in order to become a democracy, but it might be more helpful to know what you shouldn't do in order to not become a democracy. So when we started the research on this latest project, we didn't start out by, being interested in failure. We were interested and also enthusiastic about the possibility that Turkey would have a democratic constitution. The constitution-making process was planned as a very democratic process. Like political actors promised that many groups would be involved and all that. So we only shifted to studying failure at the point where the constitution-making process failed, and we still had to sort of produce output of our research and publish books and articles and all that, right? The whole the business of academic knowledge production. In the end, we found that it is indeed interesting to study failure for the simple reason that we learn by failing, right? If we look at kids, if we look at our children, if we think about ourselves, no one starts out perfect. You get better at doing what you do by failing and figuring out how you can do it better. And so we sort of like saw this process and analyzing this process as an opportunity to sketch in particular for people who might be interested to draft a constitution, elites who might be interested to draft a constitution in a similar setting, right? A conflicted society where many things are contested, that there are certain things you shouldn't do and certain things you should do in order to ensure that you get a constitution. So two things, for example, I can briefly mention. One thing is it's very bad if political actors come to the stage with very clear ideas about what they want to achieve, but without an exit strategy of what are we going to do if these ideas clash and we reach deadlock, right? And in the Turkish case, for example, you could see that very bad in the situation is that you agree on unanimity as sort of like a principle to adopt norms. So in the Turkish case, every norm that would make its way into the new constitution would have to be supported by all actors involved in the constitution-making process. That turned out to be very bad because on some issues they couldn't find agreement. So in that situation, although from a democratic perspective, you might want to assume that it would be best if everyone agrees to it, in this situation, we would argue that majoritarianism is the best decision-making modus to adopt a constitution where you, for example, have, I don't know, 2/3 majorities, where one actor who tries to block the process could be just excluded and the other actors together then carry on and will be able to realize the constitutional project that they set out to realize in the beginning.
So the idea of a failure can suit also the earlier attempts of the Republic of Turkey, I mean, like the earlier constitution, but it's also the case when we're talking about 2011, when we saw the beginning of popular process of constitution making. Now, the popular aspect of the process was quite a change from how earlier constitutions were created. Back then, Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan promised that the new constitution would ensure the broadest possible participation of civil society organizations, such as youth, women, trade unions, and so on. So what was the reason for this radical declaration, and actually what went wrong when we're talking about the 2011-2013 attempt?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, like all political and social actors agreed that Turkey needs a new constitution, and there have been attempts at drafting a new constitution since as early at least as 2004, 5, 6. There was a commission already established that failed. However, in 2010-11, it was clear, and most of the parties also campaigned with the promise to draft a new constitution. None of the parties won a majority in parliament so that they would be able to draft a constitution by themselves. So that might explain why even AKP and Erdogan were willing to let the others participate in remaking the great Turkish state. The commission was composed of all parties which were represented in parliament at the time, so the 4 parties. The idea was to organize, prior to the real drafting process, like different stages where civil society organizations could provide inputs, citizens could provide input and everything. So that's basically the setup, right? They drafted their own rules, which said we're only going to debate, or we're only going to start debating once we have all the input from civil society. One day after they had adopted the rules for themselves, they started debating. And from that point on, sort of the ideas of civil society are still in the public sphere. There are hundreds of documents somewhere stored. No one really knows where they're stored, with ideas of civil society. But those ideas never really played a role in the constitution-making process. And now, to be fair, those ideas did not only play no role for the governing party, they also didn't play a role for the opposition. And now I want to give you an example to explain why the process failed. So in the end, you can blame the AKP for the failure of the process. because they had this idea that they wanted to change the political system towards a presidential system. In the past, Turkey has a tradition of parliamentarianism or some sort of semi-presidentialism over the past years. So you have a parliament which elects a government, and then you have either by parliament or by the public elected president, and they share power, right? So Turkey wanted to Erdogan wanted to transition the state towards an American model, where you have a popularly elected executive, you have a parliament, but the parliament does not form a government. All other parties disagreed. Public polls showed that I think between 60 and 70% of the population also disagreed. Now, in this situation, if you think about functional oppositional politics, you would have expected that the opposition parties at some point in the meetings and also in public would raise this issue, that the majority of the public didn't want the transition to a presidential system, but AKP pushed for it and sort of risked that the whole process would go down. None of the parties did that. So you see that even in a critical situation where opposition parties could have benefited from public input and from public ideas, popular constitution making failed. So in the end, it's the main responsibility lies with the governing party, with the AKP, with Erdogan and his sort of power politics, his hegemonic power politics. But the other parties also contributed to the failure of this whole process.
Do you think that this failed constitution-making process between 2011 2013, do you think it was an historical moment or a kind of a critical juncture in the recent political development of Turkey?
Yes, it was.
How?
It was an important juncture because the society had the opportunity to transition towards democracy. And if you look into the debates and if you see on what contested sort of issues they were able to reach agreement, you see that they were so close, very close, to finally drafting a democratic constitution. In the end, it's a critical moment because it sort of re-established a new authoritarianism in Turkey, right? So the authoritarianism that we knew from before is either the Ottoman absolutist authoritarianism of the 19th century, or it's one-party rule under Atatürk's CHP, or military dictatorship. Now, this is civilian authoritarianism where all power is sort of centralized in the executive. So we have an executive authoritarian regime in Turkey right now, which is which means that the country is in a less promising position than they were before 2011, 2013. So it was definitely a critical moment in the recent development.
Thank you, Felix. From the failures of Turkey, I would like to move now to the Israeli case and to learn from you, Gila, Professor Stopler, about aspects of failure or perhaps intentional failure in the Israeli constitutionalism. You argue that although Israel was or still is considered a stable liberal democracy, Israel has never been a fully liberal democracy. You suggest that a better definition of Israel would be as a state with a semi-liberal constitutional structure that, from a liberal perspective, semi-liberal constitutionalism can be considered as a failure. So why do you define the constitutional structure decided on its first years of the state and developed over the years as semi-liberal constitutionalism?
Tsameret, thank you for having me and talk about these things regarding Israel. So I think it's tempting, at least in legal thought, to think about liberal constitutionalism and illiberal regimes in kind of a dichotomous terms. So you have a liberal constitutional regime that is fully committed to liberal individual rights on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have an authoritarian, illiberal regime that's only interested in buttressing the power of the state. And there's nothing in between. But we know, as a matter of fact, that there are many countries in the world that are in between and fall somewhere between these two lines. I think Israel is one of them. And I like to call this hybrid type of constitutionalism that we see in Israel as a semi-liberal constitutionalism. And that means for me that it meets two conditions. So the first is that it exhibits a simultaneous dual normative commitment to liberal rights and principles on the one hand and to other values and interests on the other. And these other values and interests result in enduring and significant restrictions on some of the rights. Now, second, this dual normative commitment is constitutive, and it's expressed in the basic elements of the system. And what makes the Israeli constitutional system a semi-liberal constitutional system is, I think, at least three very significant aspects of this system, and I'll run through them shortly. So the first one is the first deeply illiberal aspect of the Israeli system is the continued belligerent occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories that were occupied in the '67 war, and the Palestinian residents, as we know, have been living under military rule, with no citizenship and no citizenship rights for over 50 years now. Throughout this time, Israel has not claimed sovereignty over most of this territory, and therefore this occupation is viewed by international law and by the international community as temporary. So as long as allegedly it's temporary, we may passively argue that this aspect of Israel's illiberality shouldn't be considered part of its constitutional system. But as we all know, there are very powerful political forces that are currently actively trying to change this temporary status of the territories and to annex them in order to form what they call a greater Israel. And such a move would radically change Israel's constitutional system. The second aspect of Israel's deviation is the fact that some Israeli laws have different effects along ethnic lines, disparately impact the Arab citizens of the state. A very pertinent example is many of the laws pertaining to land appropriation, the extensive appropriation of Arab-owned land that was done in the early years of the state, and which haven't been returned to this day, even though some of that land hasn't even been used. Now, the third aspect is expressed in some of the aspects of the religion-state relations, especially the fact that religious courts have an exclusive jurisdiction in matters of marriage and divorce. There's no possibility of civil marriage. For example, all Jews in Israel are subject to Orthodox Jewish religious personal laws. All members of other recognized religious communities, Muslims and Christians, are subject to personal religious laws of their own denominations. And this constitutes a very serious violation both of the right to freedom of conscience and as the women's rights, being subject to discriminatory patriarchal religious laws. And these religious courts are usually run by they're all run by male judges. Most of them come from very Orthodox-oriented religions. So this is the third aspect of the illiberalness. And I think that these three aspects together make Israel to be not a liberal state, but a semi-liberal one.
So you described earlier kind of a simultaneous, or perhaps I would say a dual existence of liberal and illiberal norms and values. So how does the idea of duality or simultaneous existence contribute to our understanding? And actually, what are the consequences of this duality?
So I think generally it's important to to analyze and to identify correctly what type of state you're living in. But I think it has become even much more important in recent years due to the strong tide of democratic erosion that's sweeping the world, which is the context in which we're discussing this. Because the most important question that scholars ask themselves is, what are the conditions in which democratic erosion may succeed in turning a previously liberal democracy into a non-liberal or authoritarian regime, and to understand how and why a democratic backsliding has developed in a particular country and where it's going, it's very important to understand the background conditions. So, for example, with respect to Hungary and Poland, scholars argue that the reason for their rapid turn from liberal democracies into downright autocracy in the case of Hungary, Poland is going that way. And this is explained mostly by the fact that their commitment to liberal democracy has always, following the fall of communism, has always been only superficial. So these scholars claim that the adoption of the liberal democratic regime in both these countries was only mostly instrumental in order to ensure acceptance into the EU. And once that acceptance was granted, politicians like Urban had very easy time persuading the population to abandon liberal democratic principles and go back to traditional tribal authoritarian principles. And in this respect, I want to claim that the situation in Israel is quite similar because the commitment to liberal democratic principles has never been across the board. It has, to a large extent, been a mirage, or at least a part mirage. Israeli constitutionalism, Israeli politics, the mindset of the Israeli center have always been characterizing this type of cohabitation between liberal and illiberal norms. And so consequently, it's not surprising, in my opinion, to see that in recent years, Israel has reached a situation in which illiberal norms gradually overpower liberal ones. So this lack of liberal consensus facilitates the democratic backsliding that Israel is now experiencing.
So we discussed earlier the turning point in Turkey's contemporary history, and that was the popular constitution making process between 2011 2013, or perhaps I would say its failure to achieve a full liberal democracy back then. Is there a similar point in Israel's constitutional history, something that we can mark? We can say, okay, that's a point where a change occurred in this dual reality, or in the balance between liberal and illiberal values in Israel?
Yeah, so I think that this dual nature of Israel and those conflicting imperatives in which the Israeli state has always been living have been evident from the definition of the state, whereas most liberal democratic states do not define themselves in reference to any ethnic or religious character. Israel is defined in its basic laws as a Jewish and democratic state. This can be found even as early as the declaration of the establishment of the state in 1948, which declares that Israel would be a Jewish state, but at the same time, it will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, and sex, guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. So in the early 90s, this duality was enshrined in the two basic laws on human rights, which are Basic Law of Human Dignity and Liberty and Basic Law of Freedom of Occupation. They were passed in 92, and they afford constitutional protection to several fundamental rights. As such, you can see them, or you can look at them as the centerpieces of the liberal facets of Israel's constitutional system. But even though these basic laws, for example, do not explicitly protect the right to freedom of religion or the right to freedom of conscience, not the right to equality, not the right to free speech, nevertheless, the Israeli Supreme Court has ruled that all these rights are protected in the Basic Law of Human Dignity and Liberty, and they're all part of an essential part of the right to human dignity, and therefore they're protected by Basic Law of Human Dignity. And in most contexts, the Supreme Court has given these rights and other rights liberal interpretation based on its commitment to individual liberty and to understanding the Israeli legal system as a liberal system. In 95, in what has come to be known as the constitutional revolution by both opponents and supporters, by the way, the Supreme Court has ruled that regular legislation that contravenes these rights that are protected by the basic laws could be struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, you can also find a similar commitment in other various liberal laws in Israeli legislation. So it would be fair to say that in general, Israel is committed to maintaining a form of liberal constitutionalism that upholds these liberal rights in all these areas, in all the areas in which this commitment is not explicitly set aside in order to pursue other constitutional values. However, as we already discussed, alongside it, there is Israel is simultaneously committed in some areas of law to a form of non-liberal, ethnic, and even theocratic constitutionalism, which is set to promote non-liberal ideals. Now, it's important to note that even that so-called constitutional revolution, which is so strongly debated, even the enactment of these basic laws of human rights didn't have almost any effect on the illiberal aspects of the Israeli constitutionalism. So just to give one example, even though the legal framework that creates the exclusivity of religious personal status law, marriage and divorce, even though that legislation is set in regular legislation, it is nevertheless immune from the power of the basic laws, because basic law, human dignity and liberty contains a provision stating that the enactment shall not affect the validity of any laws enacted prior to it, which means that basic law, human dignity cannot be used to challenge the validity of any pre-existing legislation that gives state power to religion, that violates basic rights. It would be immune from the power of the basic laws. I can give similar examples with regard to the Arab citizens of Israel and, of course, the Palestinians in the occupied territories, which haven't benefited from the basic laws almost at all. But despite this very limited reach of the or liberal reach of the basic laws on human rights, and their implementation by the court has given rise to what we can call a scathing criticism against the court and against its attempts to restrict the power of the legislature through means such as annulling legislation. And therefore, the counter reaction to this move by the court, to this constitutional revolution, was and still is the suggested what we call the override clause that would allow the Knesset to override any Supreme Court decision and would consequently allow the Knesset to enact any violation of human rights that it finds fitting.
What about the basic law, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people? Can we say, or how does this basic law actually strengthen the illiberal authoritarian state in Israel?
Yeah, so I think that from what I said till now, it's clear that the coexistence between the liberal aspects of Israeli constitutionalism and the non-liberal aspects of it has been precarious and rocky for many years now. And these conflicting imperatives have been embedded in the system from the start and are by no means recent phenomenon. But I think that the nation state law is something different because one could say, look, the nation state law, and this has been said by many, the nation state law is only part of this dual nature of this. I think it's a part of it. I think it's a serious deviation from what has until now been Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state. So it's not just quantitative, let's say, it's not just a quantitative change in the constitutional landscape, but it's a qualitative change. It would be a change from what I call a semi-liberal constitutionalism into a fully the intention behind this law is to serve, or its basic law is to serve as the engine for passage into a fully non-liberal tribalist constitutionalism. So if we look at political forces that are currently in power, we see that many of them view the liberal facets of Israeli constitutionalism as a real threat to the Jewishness of the state, even to its very existence. And therefore, they're set to restrict these facets and perhaps even eliminate them altogether. So I can just give you a quote from the former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, which was referring to the balance between the Jewish and democratic and the purpose of enacting the nation-state law. And she plainly says that its purpose is to change this balance between Jewish and democratic in favor of the Jewish component. Her view is widely shared by other political forces, including those that form a bigger part of the government today. The idea that the Israeli Supreme Court in its rulings has gone too far in defending liberal principles, such as the protection of universal human rights at the expense of Israel's Jewish nature. And the purpose of the nation-state law is to put an end to that. So she says that the nation-state law will be a moral and political revolution that would ensure that Zionism will not continue, I'm quoting, will not continue to bow down to the system of individual rights interpreted in a universal way. And indeed, if we look at the nation-state basic law, we see that it doesn't include any mention of core principles of liberal democracy, such as Israel's nature as a democratic state, the right to equality, the right of the Arab citizens as a national minority. It gives clear precedence to the Jewish nature of the state over the democratic nature of the state, and allows regular legislation. It can serve as a tool to allow regular legislation to give preference to the Jewishness over the democraticness. But I think that the purpose of the nation-state law is even more, is even wider. So I think many of the current Israeli government see as a central goal the annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories and the creation of this greater Israel. And I think that the enactment of the nation-state law should be seen as a crucial component in preparing the constitutional groundwork for such an annexation. Because once this annexation takes place, if it takes place, it becomes the status of the newly annexed territories, and even more so the status of the people who reside in those territories, becomes the most fundamental question of Israeli constitutional law. And I think the main goal of some of the legislatures of the nation-state law is to guarantee the continued Jewish supremacy in this greater Israel, despite the fact that its territory will no longer include what we see, what we can count as a Jewish majority. This is, by the way, we can see this, the nation-state law is only the most recent constitutional addition to various pieces of legislation that narrow the liberal democratic space and restrict the freedom of speech, precisely in order to prevent criticism of the occupation, criticism of the Israeli actions in the occupied territories, such as, for example, the boycott law that prevents Israelis from supporting a boycott on Israel or on the occupied territories that was passed in 2011. A more recent law that prevents non-Israelis from entering Israel if there is evidence against them that they support the boycott of Israel or of the territories under its control, which has even been used to bar the entry of non-citizen Jews into Israel that oppose Israel's occupation of the territories. a widespread campaign to delegitimize human rights organizations that work for the rights of Palestinians, and end the belligerent occupations, such as breaking the silence and other examples.
Thank you, Gila. Thank you, Felix. At this point, I would like to move to our last questions, and would like to ask both of you about the current situation in Israel and Turkey, and the contemporary context of constitutionalism on the background of the coronavirus crisis and so on. But before that, I would like also to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our speakers, please write them. You can write them down in our Facebook, and we'll have some times at the end of our conversation to pick some of your questions. So Felix, what can we say? In what ways do the lack of solid legal institutions or a popular constitutions affect how the state deals with its problems? One prominent example that one can think of as a real problem of the state is, for example, violence against women, but I'm sure that you can find other examples. In what way is the current crisis affecting real problems in Turkey?
So I think that here, like, I may shift a bit away from sort of the framework of constitutionalism and talk more about the populist authoritarian nature of the current Turkish regime, because I think that's where the problems lie, or where we can sort of find an entry point to discussing the current situation. Femicides are like a problem, and there's also public awareness for that in Turkey. COVID-19 is a problem in Turkey. Turkey is in dire economic conditions. So already before COVID-19 happened, Turkey was in a bad economic situation, so bad that AKP is losing support among its voters and is now joined forces with the most unlikely coalition partner you could ever think of, their old arch enemies, the nationalist movement party, the MHP, which sort of has become the kingmaker that gives Erdogan the majorities, or the AKP the necessary votes in parliament. Now, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, in this COVID-19 situation, Erdogan is not at the center stage of Turkish politics, at least not with regard to COVID-19. So there is this newly appointed health minister in the presidential cabinet. So he's not elected by government, as it has been like the case in the past. He's appointed by President Erdogan. No one really knew this guy before he had to give daily press conferences and inform everyone about COVID-19, the state's responses, and so forth. Interestingly, most of the sort of political responses to the problem are directed by the local political level and by opposition parties. So, for example, the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara, which are both CHP, main opposition party members, have had many good ideas of how to sort of combat or reply to the problems and consequences of COVID-19 in their cities, which then a couple of days or weeks later would be picked up by the government and turned into national solutions to solve the problem. So here you can see that for a populist, it's difficult to win when you have to show hands-on politics. And just to draw the comparison to Israel, I think if you do the wrong thing and you're a populist, this can also fall on your feet, right? So what Erdogan is trying to do, I think, is sort of taking the backseat, seeing how things are developing, and rather focusing on the things that he's good in, focusing on symbolic politics. Tomorrow, the Hagia Sophia is going to be reopened as a mosque. Erdogan has offered that he would give the first prayer or lead the first prayer, and the thing that he has done in the past. So it's not that he's now sort of stylizing himself as the new Sultan of Turkey, but sort of you see in his symbolic politics, in particular with regard to the Hagia Sophia issue, that he plays with the elements of, you know, Ottoman history, the great times of Turkey, the sort of hegemony of Muslims over Christians, and sort of polarizes this issue that is hotly debated everywhere. Interestingly, what this creates is like it creates pressure for his contestants in the domestic political sphere, right? So the other day I saw an interview with former Foreign Minister and Prime Minister Ahmed Davutoglu, who has founded a new conservative religious political party last December, and who is attacking Erdogan. Now, he was asked on the issue of what he thinks about the reopening of the Hagia Sophia, and for sure he had to say, I support these plans, because he has to present himself as a conservative religious, conscious conservative religious person. He started talking about how the Spaniards treated the mosque of Cordoba and what bad state it is, and how well Turks treated the Hagia Sophia. Sort of what you see in this example of symbolic politics is that Erdogan still has the ideas and the strategies to sort of play his populist politics in a way that his opponents have a hard time to really challenge him, because he has a very strong capacity to pull them onto battleground where he feels comfortable and where he knows that he pointed in the past. So I think this would be the take, or my take, on explaining the regime's response to the current situation, where you see that basically the opposition is doing all the good work, and the government is engaging in the same political sort of play that it has been engaged in the past, like decade or even longer.
Gila, what can we say? How does the situation, how can we relate? I'm sorry. How does the situation that you described earlier actually affects the current situation in Israel, the coronavirus crisis, and so on? So what are the relations between the situation that we described earlier, the semi-liberal constitutionalism, and the current crisis in Israel?
So I think there's a very close relationship between the two. First, well, I had to be brief, so I couldn't go into much detail. But one thing which is very important, which is also very important to the illiberal aspect of Israel, is that, and I haven't said that thus far, is that Israel has actually declared the state of emergency upon its establishment in 1948, and it's still been going on. It's been under a state of emergency ever since, which is being continuously, first, for many years it was just continuous, and now every year the Knesset prolongs it. So in March, when the coronavirus came upon us, there were some very dangerous facts on the ground in Israel. One was the continuous state of emergency. The other one was that Israel was actually ruled by an interim government in which Netanyahu presided after 3 failed attempts to win a parliamentary majority. An interim government, I need to remind you, has to act in restraint, has limited powers in relation to a regular government. And the third thing was that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, wasn't even convened yet due to the fact that elections were just, the third elections were just held on March 2nd. So the political situation and all of this was in a time when Netanyahu, although he declared victory, knew that he's in a very, very precarious situation. So I think in that particular moment, Israel has reached the heights, or maybe the depth of the, of the danger of an authoritarian sliding into an authoritarian regime. And this was when Netanyahu's interim government made two moves. One of them was just shutting down the Knesset and not allowing for the replacement of the chair of the Knesset, even though the majority of the Knesset wanted that replacement. And the other thing was shutting down the courts. And that one was because in order to actually postpone the beginning of Netanyahu's trial, which was supposed to be held on March 17th. So these measures, by the way, even though they've been rescinded later, have actually achieved both of his aims. So first of all, his trial was suspended for 2 months. It's only begun on May 24th instead of March 17th. And the left-wing bloc that was against his bloc actually disintegrated and eventually went into government with him. So what we see here is a very clever political use by Netanyahu of the emergency situation of the corona in order to try to gain his, his completely out of the, completely other motivations. And this is something which we see today as well. So we see definitely that the decisions on the struggle against the coronavirus are political decisions. They keep being enmeshed with, with other political decisions. There would be a new election, there wouldn't be a new election, etc. But the fact that and I'll end with that, the fact that we are in a kind of a double emergency situation. First of all, we're always in an emergency situation, and the semi-liberal Israeli population is regular, is used to the fact that there's an emergency situation, the army, takes control, rights are restricted, that on the one hand, and then on the, to add to that, we have the corona situation, which is completely novel, nobody knows what to do about it, everybody, keeps asking themselves how we can how we can resolve that. And this gives a lot of leeway to the government, as we see around us, to take power. Again, as Felix said, the executive takes all the power. We see that also in the new corona law that was just passed last night. The executive basically takes all the power, allegedly completely legally, and then who knows what it's going to do with that power with its other interests in mind.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions from our audience. One is from Gabriel Perlin. I'll read the question. Why hasn't leftist populism been as successful in rising to power as right-wing religious and conservative populism have been in recent years? So if one of you want to answer that question.
I
can answer that question if you want to. Or do you want to answer it?
You start, Felix, and then we'll go to Gila.
Okay, so I think from my end, and I'm working with concepts, right? So as a political scientist, I work with concepts. So I think one problem is that sort of the idea of populism, left-wing or right-wing, doesn't really capture the novelty of what we observe, right? Politics has always been populist in at least the 20th century, right? So in the Soviet constitution or in Soviet bloc socialist Eastern European states' constitutions, they all promised that the state would be a democratic people's state, but that was in fact not the case. So populism is not really new. What is new about this populism that is today successful is that it is sort of our new form of authoritarianism. So populism is contemporary authoritarianism. It's not totalitarianism. It's not military dictatorship. It's a form of civilian authoritarianism that is very successful because it can sort of feed on real world problems that the left has problems to address. And so in the European context, for example, social inequality, migration are problems, real world problems that many citizens find to be problematic, and they want them to be taken care of. And sort of democratic parties have had the tendency to shy away from them and leave the ground to conservatives, which are very good in polarizing and in being discriminatory towards those people that should be excluded from the group of the people, which is basically what populism is doing, right? So for a left-wing populism, that is more difficult because it claims that it is democratic, right? And so you can think of populism in the working class movement, for example, in the 19th, 20th century working class movement, that was successful because it said, we are lobbying here on behalf of the working class, but once they were in power, they would still grant everyone the same rights, right? They would not just sort of reserve the rights for the working class, but they would also grant these rights to the bourgeoisie, to the capitalists, or whoever they saw on the other side. Now, right-wing populism tries to not do that. And so this is one of the main reasons in my perspective, why it is more successful than left-wing populism. Because left-wing populism has difficulty to reframe the real issues that populism addresses.
Gila, would you like to add something or to say something?
Yeah, I just, really short. I think that, it depends. I think it depends on what part of the world you're looking at. Because I think if you look at Latin America, you have left-wing populism there, which has been much too successful for anybody's, taste. So Venezuela is, you could look at it as a left-wing populism that, has practically ruined the country. So I think it probably has to do with, with the historical, with what type of message at a certain moment would be a message that speaks more to the people. And it's true that today, I think on the whole, right-wing populism works, is more successful, but there are places in the world in which left-wing populism is nevertheless as bad, in its results as right-wing populism.
Thank you. We'll conclude with the last questions from Tzvi Levin, and I also address both of you. If Denmark has a constitutional monarchy and Israel has a parliamentary democracy and Turkey has a military-based constitutional republic, which one is recommended? Gila, would you like to start to say something?
Denmark has a constitutional monarchy.
Monarchy, that's what it's, yeah.
Well, it depends on, so it's the question of it's like when I compare for my students the religion-state relations in Israel with the religion-state relations in the United Kingdom. And I say, in Israel, there's only a partial establishment of religion. In the United Kingdom, there's allegedly a full establishment of religion because they have a state church. And so so I ask, where is the situation better? Is it better in Britain or is it better in Israel? And obviously the answer is it's much better in Britain, because the question is not, is not the heading of what you have, but the actual arrangements. So the constitutional monarchy in Denmark doesn't really give power to the king as an authoritarian figure. It's more of a symbolic one, just like the British establishment or the English establishment is a symbolic one. Whereas, the authoritarianism in Turkey and also the authoritarian aspects of the Israeli situation are very much coercive. So I think that the question of coercion, of where the real power lies, is an extremely important one when you analyze whatever heading you have of, what type of regime this is.
Felix, one last answer?
I have not really much to add to it, but I would want to underline that it's always a question sort of how a constitution functions in a specific historical practical context. And so this tentative question is rhetorical, and I think the person who asked it knew that it was a rhetorical question. Definitely not Turkey. Definitely not Israel in the current state. I don't know if Denmark is the best sort of model for a constitutional state. I think that of the sort of more recent constitutions, if we look into constitutional practice, so if we look like what sort of constitutional models are models that other states have drawn upon in drafting constitutions in past years, then the German Constitution of '49, like the German Basic Law, or the Spanish post-Franco Constitution, these are sort of very solid democratic constitutions that have been established in a period where authoritarianism had been, like, to some extent banned from Europe, or was finally overcome in Europe. And so these constitutions would be, in my view, the ideal sort of example on which to draw upon if you want to draft a new constitution. And then I would suggest to the constitution maker to read my book to sort of understand what they shouldn't do in order to not make the same failures that the constitution makers made in Turkey. That would be my...
Thank you very much. I would like to thank both of you for this fascinating discussion. I'm sure that we got some interesting insights into the cases of Israel as well as Turkey, and also from the comparative perspective. I would like to thank also our colleagues here at Van Leer, our team here, and all the audience that was here with us. Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you.